The evening was quiet in Maplewood Hills. The sprawling mansion at the end of Rosewood Lane stood like a monument to wealth, its manicured lawns and grand marble steps glistening under the amber glow of the porch lights. Inside, Alexander Pierce, known to the world as one of the richest men in the state, sat alone in his study, sipping an expensive whiskey. His life had been a relentless climb to the top: deals, investments, acquisitions. He had it all, except, perhaps, someone to share it with. He thought nothing could surprise him anymore. Until the knock. A soft, hesitant knock echoed through the mansion. Alexander frowned, glanced at the clock. It was almost 9. Who on earth would come here unannounced? He opened the massive front door. There, on his porch, stood a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 7. Her dress was thin, her sneakers muddy and worn, and her hands clutched a faded stuffed bunny. Her cheeks were streaked with tears, her lower lip trembling as she looked up at him. Before he could even speak, she whispered, "Mom just died, and you're the only one I could think of." Alexander froze. His heart skipped a beat, his breath caught in his throat. He opened his mouth to say something, anything, but no words came. "Come in," he managed to say, stepping aside. The little girl obeyed silently, her small frame looking even smaller as she stepped into the grand foyer. She sat on the edge of a velvet chair, staring down at her bunny. "Sweetheart," Alexander said gently, kneeling to her level, "what's your name?" "Lila," she murmured. "And, how do you know me, Lila?" She looked up at him, her eyes shining with an innocence that cut straight through his soul. "My mom, she used to clean your house, years ago. Before you got so rich. She told me, if anything ever happened to her, I should come find you. She said you helped her once." And then it all came rushing back to him. Her mother, Sophie, had worked for him as a cleaner, back when he was just starting out. He remembered her bright smile, her kindness. He also remembered the day she came to him, desperate for an advance so she could pay her sick mother's hospital bills. He'd written her a check without thinking twice. And then, he never saw her again. Until now. She said you were a good man," Lila continued, her voice cracking, and that you'd help me too." Alexander felt something shift in him, something he hadn't felt in decades. He called his driver, and within the hour they were at the small apartment where Lila lived. The place was quiet. Sophie lay on the couch, pale and still. A neighbor stood nearby, shaking her head sadly. "She passed a couple hours ago," the neighbor said softly. "Poor thing. Worked herself to the bone for that little girl." Alexander stood there, looking at the lifeless woman who had once told him with pride, "I'll make sure my daughter has a better life than I ever did." And he realized, she'd kept her promise as long as she could. And now, it was his turn. The next weeks passed in a whirlwind. Alexander took care of the funeral arrangements, ensuring Sophie was laid to rest with dignity. He hired lawyers to handle custody, determined to give Lila a home. He moved her into the mansion and enrolled her in the best school in the city. At night, he read her bedtime stories in the same study where he'd once sat alone, staring into the bottom of his whiskey glass. Lila brought life back to his home, and to his heart. One evening, months later, as they sat watching the sunset from the balcony, Lila leaned her head on his shoulder and whispered, "Mom was right. You really are a good man." Alexander swallowed the lump in his throat, pulling her closer. "No, sweetheart," he said softly, "you're the one who reminded me how to be." And so, the millionaire who thought he had everything found the one thing he'd been missing all along: a reason to give, a reason to love, a reason to hope. Because sometimes, it takes a little knock on your door to open your heart.